In American crime history, power has always had a face. Al Capone smiled for cameras. Lucky Luciano built rules. John Gotti wore tailored suits and waved to reporters. They were loud, visible, almost theatrical. America learned to recognize that kind of criminal. And while the country watched Italian mobsters rise and fall in courtrooms and headlines, something far colder was happening, quietly, patiently, outside the spotlight. It didn't arrive with swagger. It didn't announce itself with gunfire. It didn't need approval from New York's 5 families. It arrived silently, disguised as desperation, refugees, immigrants, families fleeing collapse, and hidden among them were men who had already survived a world far more brutal than anything America had ever built. To understand the Russian Mafia in America, you have to erase one assumption. These men were not shaped by capitalism. They were shaped by scarcity, by hunger, by surveillance, by betrayal as a daily reality. The Soviet Union was not just a country, it was a pressure cooker. For decades, ordinary citizens lived under constant suspicion. A joke could send you to prison. A neighbor could destroy your life with a single accusation. Trust was dangerous, silence was survival, and crime didn't grow despite the system. It grew because of it. In the Soviet world, the black market wasn't optional. It was necessary. If you wanted meat, medicine, spare parts, or favors, you didn't ask the state. You asked criminals, and criminals learned something early. Power doesn't come from violence alone. It comes from control of access. Who gets food? Who gets protection? Who gets silence? That mindset would later translate perfectly into American capitalism. Long before Brighton Beach, there was the Gulag, a vast network of labor camps stretching across frozen wilderness. Millions entered, many never returned. Inside those camps, law did not exist, only hierarchy. And at the top of that hierarchy were men who called themselves vori v zakone, thieves in law. They weren't thieves in the casual sense. They were ideological criminals. They rejected normal life entirely. No families, no legal jobs, no cooperation with authorities. Their loyalty belonged only to crime itself. To betray that code was worse than death. Inside the camps, the vori didn't just survive, they ruled. While political prisoners froze and starved, the thieves controlled food distribution, warm clothing, access to protection. They decided who lived longer and who didn't. Violence was precise, not emotional, and identity was carved into skin. Tattoos became resumes. Every symbol had meaning. Stars on shoulders meant authority. Churches meant rank. Barbed wire meant a life sentence. You didn't ask who someone was. You read them. This was crime as a profession, refined, disciplined, merciless. What made this underworld different from the Italian Mafia was simple. There was no romance, no loyalty to bloodlines, no nostalgia, no mercy. The vori believed prison was not a failure. It was proof. Proof you hadn't cooperated. Proof you hadn't broken. That mindset would later terrify American law enforcement, because how do you threaten a man with prison when prison already made him powerful? By the 1970s, the Soviet system was collapsing from the inside. Factories failed, officials stole openly, police sold protection, and criminals adapted. Some began cooperating with the state, trading information for comfort. To the old-school thieves, this was treason. A silent war erupted. Inside prisons, inside criminal networks, inside the shadows. Men were killed not for money, but for violating the code. This internal violence produced a new kind of criminal, less ideological, more flexible, more dangerous. Then something unexpected happened. The Soviet Union opened its borders. Emigration became possible, especially for Soviet Jews. To the West, this looked like freedom. To Soviet authorities, it looked like relief. Why keep feeding criminals when you could export them? So they let them go. What left the USSR wasn't just people. It was an entire criminal education. Men trained in smuggling, bribery, intimidation, financial manipulation, and they were headed to a country built on opportunity. When these men arrived in the United States, they didn't come with grand plans. At first, they came poor, confused, invisible. They didn't know English well. They didn't understand the law, but they understood systems. And they quickly realized something shocking. America trusted paperwork. America trusted contracts. America trusted that rules would be followed. That trust was exploitable. Brighton Beach became the ideal cover, a struggling seaside neighborhood in Brooklyn, cheap apartments, a fading boardwalk, Russian food, Cyrillic signs. To outsiders, it looked harmless. To the underworld, it looked perfect. A place where Russian could be spoken openly, where questions weren't asked, where everyone had come from somewhere else. And slowly, quietly, power began to organize. This wasn't the Italian model. There were no bosses in silk suits, no formal ceremonies, no commission. This was a network, not a hierarchy. Money flowed upward, fear flowed outward, and anyone who interfered was erased without warning. No negotiations, no second chances. By the early 1980s, something new existed in America. Not a gang, not a family, not an organization you could map, but a criminal culture imported from a world where mercy was a liability. The FBI wouldn't recognize it at first. The Italian Mafia wouldn't take it seriously, and that mistake would cost them years. Because while America was watching old kings fall, a colder empire was just beginning to rise. Brighton Beach did not look like a criminal capital. That was its greatest strength. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, it was a place of exhaustion, not ambition. A neighborhood filled with people who had already lost everything once. Elderly men sat on benches facing the Atlantic, wrapped in coats even in summer. Women carried plastic bags filled with black bread, herring, and cheap fruit. Children translated English for their parents at grocery counters and bus stops. This was not a place Americans feared. It was a place Americans ignored. And in the world of organized crime, invisibility is power. Most of the people arriving in Brighton Beach were not criminals. They were engineers, doctors, teachers, people whose degrees meant nothing in America. They cleaned offices, drove taxis, worked double shifts. But the Soviet habit followed them. Do not ask questions. Do not trust authorities. Do not draw attention. That silence created the perfect environment for criminal structures to grow unnoticed, because criminals thrive where no one wants trouble. On the surface, Brighton Beach was cultural. Russian bookstores, basement restaurants, music pouring into the street late at night. But underneath that warmth, another economy was forming, one that didn't rely on permits or taxes or laws. Protection money was collected quietly, not with threats shouted on street corners, but with calm conversations in kitchens and back rooms. If you didn't pay, something subtle happened. A business license problem, a health inspection, a fire that never got solved. Violence was rare, but implied. An implication was enough. The Italian Mafia had always believed one thing: if you control unions, construction, and docks, you control the city. Brighton Beach didn't fit that model. No unions, no big contracts, no obvious rackets, just immigrants scraping by. To the Italian families, the Russians were irrelevant. That miscalculation would haunt them, because the Russians weren't building power through territory. They were building it through systems. Russian criminals noticed something Italians often ignored. America ran on bureaucracy, forms, invoices, tax credits, refunds, and bureaucracy could be bent. They studied insurance claims, disability payments, bank loans, fraud replaced gunfire. Why risk murder charges when paperwork could steal millions? This shift made them almost invisible to traditional law enforcement because police were trained to look for violence, not spreadsheets. By the early 1980s, Brighton Beach had something resembling order, not a boss, not a hierarchy, but connectors. Men who linked street criminals, financial scammers, smugglers, foreign contacts. If someone needed documents, weapons, or money laundering, they knew who to call. Names weren't spoken loudly. They didn't need to be. This is where Evsei Agron re-enters the story. Agron understood something critical. American crime didn't need brutality up front. It needed credibility. He positioned himself as a mediator, someone who solved problems quietly, debt disputes, business disagreements, territorial friction. If violence was needed, it was fast and final, but never public, never emotional. Agron didn't rule by fear alone. He ruled by predictability, and predictability builds loyalty. Italian bosses demanded tribute. Russian leaders demanded competence. You weren't promoted for loyalty. You were promoted for results. That single difference made the organization harder to destroy. Because when someone fell, another stepped in seamlessly. No ceremonies, no disruption, just continuity. During this period, the FBI was obsessed with dismantling Italian families, wiretaps, RICO cases, high-profile trials. Brighton Beach didn't produce headlines, so it didn't produce urgency. Agents later admitted they didn't understand what they were seeing. This didn't look like organized crime, one investigator said. That was the problem. Eventually, violence came, not chaotic, not theatrical, targeted, a body found, no witnesses, no noise. Each killing reinforced a message. Do not interfere, do not cooperate, do not ask. The community understood, because many had come from a place where asking questions was fatal. By the mid-1980s, Brighton Beach had become something new, a criminal hub that didn't announce itself, no flashy bosses, no newspaper nicknames, just influence. Money moved through, gas stations, car dealerships, import-export companies, legitimate fronts, masking illegitimate flows, and law enforcement still struggled to define the threat. By the time anyone realized what Brighton Beach had become, it was too late. This wasn't a gang you could dismantle with arrests. It was a mindset, a system transplanted from the Gulag to Brooklyn. And it was about to expand far beyond the boardwalk. The Russian Mafia's most dangerous weapon in America wasn't a gun, it was paperwork. While law enforcement was trained to chase violence, the Russians learned to weaponize something far quieter: the system itself. In the Soviet Union, nothing worked unless it was bent. Rules were obstacles. Laws were suggestions. Survival required improvisation. So when Russian criminals arrived in the United States, they didn't see stability. They saw opportunity. America trusted documentation. If a form was stamped, if an invoice looked official, if a company existed on paper, the system assumed it was legitimate. That assumption would cost billions. It began with something no one paid attention to: gas stations. Every time fuel was sold in America, taxes were collected at multiple levels: federal, state, local. The system relied on honesty and accurate reporting. Russian criminals realized something shocking. If you manipulated the chain just slightly, money disappeared, not into pockets, into shadows. The scheme was simple in concept and devastating in scale. Shell companies were created, hundreds of them. Fuel was sold on paper from one company to another. Each transaction shifted tax responsibility. At the end of the chain, the company responsible for paying taxes vanished, closed, bankrupt, untraceable. The fuel was real, the paperwork was fake, and the government never got paid. There were no victims screaming, no bodies, no robberies, no alarms, just missing numbers, a few cents per gallon. Multiply that by millions of gallons, across multiple states, over years. The result was staggering. Billions of dollars gone, quietly. This kind of crime fit the Russian Mafia perfectly. No witnesses, no emotional outbursts, no need for loyalty ceremonies, just accountants, lawyers, and people who knew how to disappear. Italian mobsters watched in disbelief. They were used to controlling territory. The Russians were controlling flows. The money changed everything. Brighton Beach was no longer enough. Operations spread. New Jersey, Florida, California, anywhere paperwork could be manipulated, anywhere oversight was weak. Russian criminals didn't need to dominate neighborhoods. They dominated industries. By the time federal agencies noticed irregularities, the trail was already cold. Companies dissolved, records destroyed, witnesses silent, and the criminals didn't fit the expected profile. They didn't brag. They didn't fight. They didn't even look criminal. Some wore cheap jackets, drove old cars, lived quietly. That made them harder to notice and harder to stop. What made this fraud terrifying wasn't just the money, it was the mindset behind it. These men weren't chasing luxury, they were chasing control. Control over systems, over rules, over institutions. They didn't want to be kings, they wanted to be invisible architects. When violence happened, it was deliberate, targeted. Someone talked, someone threatened exposure, someone crossed a line. The response was fast and final. No warnings, no escalation, just absence. That unpredictability kept everyone in line. Italian mafia families began to understand something was wrong. Money was moving without them. Industries they thought were safe were being infiltrated. And worst of all, they didn't know who was in charge. You can negotiate with a boss. You can't negotiate with a network. Eventually, some Italians tried to cooperate. Shared rackets, joint ventures, temporary partnerships. But these alliances were fragile because the Russian approach was transactional. No history, no sentiment. If the math didn't work, the partnership ended permanently. By the early 1990s, federal agencies adapted. Financial analysts replaced street cops. Forensics shifted from bullets to spreadsheets. Undercover agents learned Russian, studied culture, built patience. This wasn't a war you won quickly. It was one you survived slowly. Eventually pressure mounted. Bank audits, wire transfers flagged, paper trails reconstructed. Arrests followed. Not dramatic, not public. Quiet indictments, years-long sentences. But even then, the structure didn't collapse because it was never centralized. By the end of the 1990s, one truth was undeniable. The Russian Mafia had changed American organized crime. They proved you didn't need bloodshed to build an empire. You needed patience, education, and the willingness to disappear. For a time, the Russian Mafia believed it had found the perfect crime. No blood, no witnesses, no headlines, just numbers moving quietly from one account to another. But money has a side effect. It attracts attention. And attention attracts competition. By the early 1990s, Russian criminal networks were richer than anyone expected. Not flashy rich, not public rich, but structurally rich. They controlled pipelines of cash, documents, and influence. And that kind of power doesn't stay contained. Soon, disputes began to surface. Not with police, with other criminals. The Italian Mafia had dominated American organized crime for decades. They believed certain industries belonged to them by tradition. Construction unions, gambling, labor. The Russians didn't respect tradition, they respected leverage. And when Russian money began appearing in Italian-controlled spaces, tension followed. At first there were meetings, calm conversations in back rooms, attempts to understand each other. But there was a fundamental problem. The Italians wanted hierarchy. The Russians wanted efficiency. Neither trusted the other. Italian mobsters grew up with a code: loyalty to family, respect for rank, permission before violence. Russian criminals grew up with something else entirely: survival over sentiment. If someone was a liability, they were removed. No vote, no ceremony. That difference made cooperation fragile and dangerous. As profits increased, deals began to fracture. Payments arrived late, percentages were disputed, information leaked. Each side suspected betrayal, and suspicion in organized crime is often enough to trigger violence. The first killings were quiet, unclaimed, unexplained. A body here, a disappearance there, messages without signatures. For years, the Russian Mafia had avoided public bloodshed. Now that restraint faded. Not because they enjoyed violence, because violence solved problems quickly. A man who talked was removed. A partner who resisted vanished. And the message traveled faster than any meeting ever could. This wasn't just an American problem anymore. Russian networks connected Eastern Europe, Israel, Germany, Cyprus. Money moved across borders effortlessly. Weapons followed, so did people. Kidnappings increased, extortion crossed continents. Victims weren't just criminals. They were businessmen, bankers, middlemen. Anyone with access became a target. One of the most chilling evolutions was kidnapping. Russian groups specialized in precision abductions. No chaos, no ransom notes taped to doors. Victims vanished quietly. Families received calm phone calls. Deadlines were clear. So were consequences. This wasn't desperation, it was logistics. American agencies struggled to keep up. Jurisdiction stopped at borders. Evidence vanished overseas. Witnesses disappeared or refused to talk. Even when arrests happened, cases collapsed due to complexity. Too many shell companies, too many layers, too many countries. The Russian Mafia wasn't hiding anymore. It was operating above the fog. Inside the networks, something changed. Earlier, discipline had held things together. Now, fear did. Men didn't trust each other. They trusted money. And when money faltered, betrayal followed. This internal pressure created instability, which made violence more unpredictable. By the mid-1990s, it became clear this empire was not invincible. Its strength, decentralization, was also its weakness. There was no single leader to restrain excess, no authority to de-escalate conflict, only momentum, and momentum eventually crashes. American authorities adapted again. They stopped chasing bosses. Instead, they targeted bankers, lawyers, accountants, middlemen. They followed money across borders. They pressured allies. They waited. Patience became the weapon. Quietly, networks began to shrink. Key figures were extradited, others fled, some disappeared permanently. No press conferences, no victory speeches, just silence. And in organized crime, silence often means defeat. The Russian Mafia had proven something undeniable. Crime didn't need tradition to succeed, but it did need balance, and balance was slipping. Every criminal empire reaches a point where external enemies matter less than internal fear. For the Russian Mafia in America, that moment arrived quietly, not with a war, not with a single betrayal, but with doubt. The Russian underworld was never built on friendship. It was built on usefulness. As long as money flowed and problems disappeared, alliances held. But once pressure increased, from law enforcement, rivals, and international scrutiny, usefulness became fragile. Men began asking silent questions. Who's talking? Who's skimming? Who's next? And when trust disappears, violence becomes preemptive. Unlike Italian mobsters, Russian criminals did not fear incarceration. Many had already lived in camps where survival required brutality. Prison was not the end of life. It was a continuation of it. That created a dangerous dynamic. Threats didn't work, so punishment escalated. When Russian mobsters cooperated with authorities, they didn't do it emotionally. They did it strategically. They traded information for relocation, for immunity, for survival. And when someone was suspected of cooperating, there was no investigation, only erasure. This paranoia hollowed the organization from the inside. The Russian Mafia had no single ruler. That was its strength. But now it became its weakness. There was no figure capable of calming disputes, no authority to stop retaliations. Each cell acted independently, which meant mistakes multiplied. Earlier violence had been symbolic, now it was chaotic. Victims were killed not to send warnings, but to relieve suspicion. Wrong men died. That created more enemies, more instability, more fear. Federal agencies noticed the shift. They stopped intervening aggressively. Instead, they watched, let rivalries burn, let paranoia do the work. This wasn't negligence, it was strategy, because criminal networks often collapse faster when left alone. Banks tightened oversight, wire transfers slowed, foreign accounts froze. Suddenly, money didn't move as easily, and when money stopped flowing smoothly, the system fractured. People demanded answers. No one had them. Younger criminals didn't grow up in the Gulag. They grew up in America. They lacked patience. They talked too much, spent too openly, trusted too easily. They attracted attention, and attention was fatal. Some Russian mobsters began enjoying their success. Cars, restaurants, nightclubs. They forgot the rule that had protected them: never look powerful. That mistake brought surveillance, which brought indictments, which brought fear. For years, Russian criminals felt safe behind borders. That changed. International cooperation increased. Extradition treaties expanded. Suddenly, fleeing wasn't protection. It was a delay. And delays breed desperation. Some men vanished into obscurity. They closed businesses, changed names, moved states. This wasn't escape. It was retreat. The empire wasn't defeated in battle. It was abandoned. By the late 1990s, the Russian Mafia was no longer expanding. It was surviving. And survival is a defensive posture. The FBI didn't defeat the Russian Mafia with force. They defeated it with psychology. For decades, American law enforcement had learned how to fight Italian organized crime. They understood hierarchy. They understood rituals. They understood loyalty. But Russian criminal networks didn't work like families. There were no initiation ceremonies, no lifetime oaths, no emotional bonds, just transactions. That made them harder to predict, but easier to fracture. The FBI realized something critical. Russian mobsters feared abandonment more than prison, being cut off from money, from contacts, from protection. That fear could be weaponized. Instead of mass arrests, agents focused on selective pressure. One arrest here, one frozen account there, one denied visa. Enough to cause panic, but not enough to unite them. Italian mobsters resisted cooperation because of omerta. Russian mobsters had no such myth. They had only survival. When offered deals, new identities, money, relocation, many took them. But they didn't just give names, they gave systems. Federal investigators dismantled the gasoline tax fraud piece by piece, not with raids, with accountants. Every fake invoice became evidence. Every shell company became a map. And once prosecutors understood the system, they realized something terrifying. The Russian Mafia had outperformed Wall Street criminals, and that terrified Congress. This was no longer just crime. This was national revenue theft. Billions lost. Congress demanded action. Funding surged. Agencies coordinated. This wasn't a task force. It was a campaign. Agents didn't just listen. They became participants. They laundered money, moved goods, introduced investors. For the first time, criminals didn't know who was real anymore. Trust collapsed completely. Every internal killing left evidence: phones, cars, witnesses. The violence that once protected secrecy now destroyed it. Each murder made the FBI's case stronger. Russian intelligence agencies, once hostile, now cooperated selectively. Old enemies became temporary allies. Names crossed borders. Files reopened. Past crimes resurfaced. There was nowhere left to hide. For years, Russian mobsters believed America was soft, legalistic, slow, overly procedural. They were wrong. When the state focused, it was relentless. High-profile indictments followed, not dozens, just enough. Key financiers, trusted intermediaries, account managers. The spine snapped quietly. Those not imprisoned faded. They opened small businesses, changed lifestyles, stopped taking risks. The empire didn't explode. It collapsed inward. The Russian Mafia didn't disappear. It transformed, smaller, quieter, cautious, no longer ambitious, no longer dominant. The takeover had ended, not with headlines, but with silence. When people say the Russian Mafia was defeated, they imagine arrests, prison doors slamming shut, headlines fading. That's not how it ended, because criminal empires don't die like people do. They shed skin. By the late 1990s, the Russian Mafia no longer looked like a single force. It had fractured into cells, smaller crews, independent operators, loose alliances built on profit, not loyalty. No flags, no names, no visible hierarchy. And that was intentional. The survivors learned a brutal lesson from the FBI crackdown. Visibility equals death. Public violence vanished almost overnight. No more shootings in Brighton Beach. No more bodies dumped on highways. No more brazen threats. Not because the criminals became moral, because violence attracted attention, and attention had become lethal. Instead, the new generation embraced something far safer: financial crime, credit card fraud, healthcare scams, insurance manipulation, online identity theft, cryptocurrency laundering, crimes without blood, without witnesses, without crime scenes, and most importantly, without victims who could point a finger. Brighton Beach stopped being the center. The internet became the new territory. Russian-speaking cybercriminals began operating across continents, servers in one country, money in another, victims thousands of miles away, no borders, no jurisdiction. Some former figures didn't adapt. They retired. They opened restaurants, car dealerships, import-export firms. On paper, legitimate. In reality, quietly laundering what remained. These men still met, still spoke Russian, still remembered the old rules, but they no longer believed in empires. The Italian Mafia produced iconic leaders. The Russian Mafia learned not to. Leadership attracted danger, so power became distributed, replaceable, invisible. No one worth targeting. The FBI had learned how to fight organizations, but now they were facing networks, fluid, anonymous, technologically advanced. By the time a case was built, the criminals had already evolved. Today, Russian criminal networks operate globally. They partner with Eastern European hackers, Asian money launderers, Western financial criminals. Ideology doesn't matter. Only profit. No fur coats, no flashy nightclubs, no vodka-soaked deals. The modern operator looks like a consultant. Clean, educated, unremarkable. That's the point. Even now, Brighton Beach remains symbolic. Not a headquarters, a birthplace. A reminder of what happens when political collapse, economic chaos, criminal expertise meet opportunity. Many second-generation immigrants rejected crime entirely. Others absorbed it quietly, not as gangsters, as businessmen, as hackers, as facilitators. Crime became inherited, not taught, but understood. Privately, federal agents acknowledged the truth. They didn't eliminate Russian organized crime. They forced it underground. And underground is where it thrives best. In the 1980s, fear came from guns and bombs. Today, fear comes from something quieter. Your bank account draining overnight, your identity erased, your business destroyed digitally. No suspects, no faces, no revenge. Because the Russian Mafia was never just about crime. It was about adaptation, survival, and understanding systems better than those who built them. Every empire collapses, but not every empire disappears. Some simply learn how to hide. There is a moment in every criminal empire's life when survival stops being about violence and starts being about access. For the Russian underworld, that moment came when they realized something simple. You don't need to fight the system if you can sit inside it. In the Soviet Union, criminals learned to survive by bribing officials. In America, they learned something more powerful. Officials didn't need to be bribed directly. They could be partnered, lawyers, accountants, bankers, politicians at the edges of power, people who didn't see themselves as criminals, just professionals helping clients. That distinction changed everything. Russian networks didn't launder money like Italians did. They didn't run cash-heavy pizza shops or clubs. They used real estate shell corporations, offshore trusts, art markets, sports franchises. Money moved invisibly, clean on paper, untouchable in court. By the late 1990s, Russian-linked money was flowing into Manhattan real estate, Florida developments, luxury condos, commercial buildings, not in suitcases, through wire transfers, layered, fragmented, legal-looking. Entire neighborhoods were reshaped by money no one could trace cleanly. Russian criminal groups learned something American gangs never mastered. Political chaos creates opportunity. They didn't back parties. They backed confusion. Campaign donations through intermediaries, lobbyists with questionable clients, consultants paid to open doors. Nothing illegal on the surface, everything corrosive underneath. By the early 2000s, Russian networks were no longer isolated. They collaborated with Latin American cartels, logistics, Asian syndicates, laundering, Western fraud rings, execution, no loyalty, no ideology, just efficiency. Law enforcement agencies faced a nightmare. Crimes committed in one country by servers in another with money parked in a third. Jurisdiction collapsed, cases stalled, extradition failed, and criminals knew it. The old Russian mobsters feared prison. The new generation fears exposure. They don't kill, they erase. Digital footprints vanish. Companies dissolve overnight. Funds reroute instantly. A crime scene with no scene. The most powerful weapon was no longer fear. It was dependency. Officials relied on donors. Banks relied on deposits. Cities relied on development money. Pulling away became expensive, dangerous, politically inconvenient. Some American executives suspected. Most didn't care. As long as money flowed and contracts stayed legal-looking. criminal money didn't announce itself. It behaved. Privately, investigators admitted the Russian underworld had achieved something rare. They made themselves necessary. And necessary criminals are the hardest to remove. This wasn't domination by force. It was domination by normalization. Criminal money stopped being dirty. It became foreign investment. Violence disrupts systems, and systems were now profitable. Anyone who threatened that balance was quietly removed from the network, not killed, excluded, frozen out. The most powerful figures today don't live in Brighton Beach, don't speak loudly, don't flash wealth. They sit on boards, own funds, advise quietly. You've walked past them. You just didn't know. The Russian Mafia didn't conquer America. It adapted to it, learned its laws, exploited its openness, used its complexity as cover. This is the question no one likes to ask, not politicians, not banks, not law enforcement, because the answer is uncomfortable. America didn't invite the Russian underworld in, but it opened the door wide enough for them to walk through unnoticed. Immigration systems built on compassion, financial systems built on trust, legal systems built on presumption of innocence. To criminals trained in deception, this wasn't weakness. It was opportunity. Three forces collided at once: the collapse of the Soviet Union, the explosion of global finance, the rise of digital anonymity. Millions moved. Money moved faster. Oversight lagged behind. Criminals didn't break the system. They outran it. In the 1990s, American banks were desperate for capital. Foreign money was welcomed. Background checks were minimal. Shell companies were routine. Ownership structures were opaque. As long as paperwork looked clean, funds were accepted. No one asked where the money really came from. Luxury real estate became the ideal laundering tool. High value, low scrutiny, cash-friendly, condos purchased through LLCs, no questions asked. Entire skylines quietly absorbed criminal wealth. Elite law firms provided legal distance. They didn't commit crimes. They created structures. Plausible deniability became an art form. If questioned, they pointed to paperwork. Paperwork never goes to prison. Campaign finance laws allowed indirect influence. Donations routed through intermediaries. Lobbyists paid to educate lawmakers. Nothing overt, nothing illegal on paper. But influence was purchased quietly, because stopping it meant admitting failure, failure of oversight, failure of regulation, failure of imagination. No agency wanted ownership of that. Some agents pushed aggressively. Others warned, these aren't gangsters, they're financiers now. Cases stalled. Prosecutions weakened. Evidence dissolved into complexity. No bodies, no witnesses, just spreadsheets, contracts, and offshore accounts. Juries didn't understand them. Judges hesitated. Defense attorneys overwhelmed the process. Transparency, rule of law, open markets. These strengths became vulnerabilities. Criminals didn't fight the system. They learned it better than those enforcing it. Was every businessman complicit? No, but many didn't want to know. Willful ignorance became protection. If criminal money stabilizes markets, if it funds development, if it employs people, at what point does removing it cause more damage than leaving it? That question paralyzed action. Russian-linked money stopped raising alarms. It became just another investor. The word mafia disappeared, replaced by foreign capital, private equity, high net worth clients. Language softened reality. Every empire believes it's immune. Every system believes it's smarter than criminals. They're always wrong. Empires usually fall loudly, with gunfire, with arrests, with televised trials. The Russian Mafia in America did none of that. It simply stopped being visible, and that is what makes it the most dangerous. If you go looking for the Russian Mafia today, you won't find smoky back rooms or men with prison tattoos flashing authority. You'll find silence, office buildings, legal firms, investment vehicles, encrypted chats. The people who survived learned the final lesson: power that is seen can be taken. Many of the original figures are gone. Some died quietly. Some remain imprisoned. Some returned to Eastern Europe. Their era, built on brute force and fear, ended, but they left something behind: knowledge. The next generation didn't inherit guns, they inherited systems. How to exploit loopholes, how to hide ownership, how to move money invisibly, how to stay legally untouchable. They don't call themselves criminals, they call themselves consultants. Media attention follows violence, and violence disappeared. Not because crime ended, but because it evolved. There are no crime scenes for algorithms. Modern Russian-linked crime lives online. Ransomware attacks, corporate blackmail, infrastructure sabotage, financial manipulation, crimes measured in data, not blood, and victims who never know who attacked them. Privately, investigators admit this war was never won. It was contained, temporarily. Criminal networks adapt faster than laws. Always have. The Russian Mafia didn't conquer America. America absorbed it. Its openness, its complexity, its appetite for money, all became tools. Because the conditions that created this empire haven't disappeared: political instability, mass migration, economic inequality, digital anonymity. These are not past problems. They are present realities. History doesn't repeat itself. It rhymes. Different faces, different languages, same structure. Wherever systems are complex, crime will learn to live inside them. That organized crime looks like movies, that it announces itself, that it needs violence. It doesn't. The most successful criminals never scare you. They blend in. If a criminal empire stops killing, stops threatening, stops showing itself, but continues profiting, did it really end? Or did it finally succeed? Brighton Beach is still there. Families still walk the boardwalk. Restaurants still serve borscht and black bread. Old men still play chess. Life looks normal. And that's the point. This story was never just about gangsters. It was about adaptation, about how power survives, about how systems can be used by those who understand them better than those who built them, and about a criminal empire that didn't die. It learned how to disappear, because the most dangerous empires in history aren't the ones that collapse. They're the ones that learn how to live quietly inside the world we think we control.